In March of 1909, inside a damp county hearing room in Maine, a man from the basement cells interrupted a judge with a sentence no one in the room was ready to hear. He did not beg for release. He did not deny the charge. He simply asked why the wall behind his cot sounded hollow after midnight, and why cold air came through the mortar like the cell was built against an open passage. The room laughed at first, a prisoner hearing voices in the stone, a drunk, a drifter, another story from the lower ward. But then he said something that changed the mood. He said he had counted the steps, not in his cell, beyond it. He claimed there was a corridor behind the rear wall of the basement block, a narrow opening, a second passage, a run of stone steps that did not belong to the official jail plan. He said the corridor continued past the furnace line, under the older foundation, and ended at a sealed arch fitted with iron rings far high for an ordinary man to reach without standing on the ledge. That was when the clerk stopped writing. That was when one deputy reportedly turned toward the county engineer. And that was when the witness, still standing in chains, described one final detail that should not have existed at all. He said the air down there did not smell like the sea, coal, or mold. It smelled dry, ancient, like a room that had been closed long before the jail was ever built on top of it. By the next morning, masons were already in the basement, not repairing a crack, not reinforcing a wall, bricking over a corridor. Officially, nothing unusual had happened. The hearing record was later summarized as a complaint from a disturbed inmate housed in poor conditions. The site logs mention maintenance, moisture, and structural securing of lower access. That was the story kept on paper. But paper does not explain why a routine hearing suddenly produced emergency masonry work. Paper does not explain why basement measurements from earlier maintenance sketches no longer matched the post-repair layout. And paper definitely does not explain why the men hired to seal the wall were ordered to work after dark. This is the story of Maine's Forgotten Cell Witness, a basement complaint that sounded insane until the building itself started changing around it, a hearing that ended with a wall, a corridor no one was supposed to map, and a question that gets stranger the deeper you go. What exactly was under that jail before the jail was there at all? Because once you start tracing the fragments left behind, this stops looking like one prisoner's imagination. It starts looking like a buried level, a missing piece of old Maine, and maybe something much older than the officials who rushed to hide it. The witness was described in the surviving summaries as ordinary enough to be ignored. Middle-aged, coastal laborer, held briefly after a disturbance near the docks. Not educated, not politically connected, not the kind of man whose words were expected to outlive the weak. That matters, because stories like this are easiest to erase when they come from people no one planned to believe. But the details attached to his testimony are what make this case so hard to dismiss. He did not tell a wild story all at once. He built it slowly. First came the sound. He told the court that nights in the lower cell block had a pattern. At around the same hour, after the stove quieted and the men above stopped moving, there would be a faint tapping inside the rear wall. Not random scratchings, measured knocks, then a draft, then once what he described as a distant metal strike somewhere beyond the stone. The jailer reportedly told him rats could sound like anything in old foundations. That answer might have worked if the wall had stayed solid. But according to later recollections, a patch of mortar near the back corner had already begun to crumble.
The witness said he pressed his ear to the loosened seam and heard space on the other side, not packed earth, not foundation fill, space. He claimed he worked at the seam with a spoon handle and found an older stone edge behind the visible wall, like the jail had been lined over something earlier. That is where the story should have ended. A damaged basement, a prisoner with too much time, a repair job. Instead, one deputy made the mistake of checking. A maintenance lantern was brought down, the outer mortar around the rear section was tested, and according to a notation later quoted in a county expense ledger, there appeared to be a void requiring immediate closure. A void, not a crack, not a leak, a void. That one word changes everything. Because a void means the witness was not describing madness, he was describing architecture. And once there's architecture, there has to be a history. The official building was supposed to be a modified lower service level attached to a later public structure. Practical, crude, expanded in stages, nothing mysterious, but old service levels do not usually hide parallel corridors. They do not usually contain stonework that sits behind newer masonry, like one building was wrapped around another. And they certainly do not trigger a hearing room dispute over whether certain lower plans should be entered into the record. Yes, that part matters too, because scattered references suggest the hearing briefly shifted from the prisoner's condition to the question of old plans. Someone asked whether the rear basement had ever been fully surveyed after the last renovation. Someone else answered that previous plans were incomplete because they had inherited older work. Older work. Again, the language is careful, too careful. No one says tunnel. No one says chamber, no one says pre-existing structure. But the witness kept talking. He described the opening as just wide enough to turn sideways through. He said the steps beyond were worn in the middle, not broken at the edges like new construction, but rounded, as if thousands of feet had used them long before the county ever put cells nearby. And then he said there were doors down there. Not modern doors, low-arched openings in heavy stone, one blocked, one hanging partly open. That was the moment his testimony stopped sounding like a complaint and started sounding like a map.
Once a witness begins describing places he should not be able to describe, every missing record starts to feel less like bad filing and more like a decision. The strongest part of this case is not one dramatic document. It is the pattern of small things that should not line up, but do. A supply order appears within 48 hours of the hearing for brick, lime, iron fasteners, and night labor in the lower level. A custodial note mentions restricted basement access for stability and contamination concerns, though no sickness outbreak was listed that month. A later maintenance sketch shows the basement corridor shortened by several feet compared to an earlier plumbing diagram. And one local recollection, recorded decades later, claims workers were told not to discuss the old back run after the wall was sealed. The old back run. That phrase sounds like shop talk, the kind of phrase people use when a thing already has a known name. So if the corridor was only discovered because one prisoner heard air in the wall, why did workers already have a name for it? That is where secondary testimony enters the picture. Years after the hearing, a former janitor's daughter allegedly recalled her father saying the building had two basements pretending to be one. He told her the visible basement was county work, but parts of the rear stone did not match. Bigger blocks, different mortar, strange anchor points. He once joked that the jail was built inside the bones of something else. A joke, maybe, unless he was right. Then there is the furnace issue.
One engineer's note in a later reference to lower wall dampness states that heat lines had failed to properly warm the rear section because the void beyond the masonry drew temperature downward. That matters because cold sink behavior can happen in ordinary underground spaces, but this was not described as soil chill. It was described like a deeper hollow was pulling air away from the occupied basement. A deeper hollow. So how far did it go? The witness had an answer. He said he thought the corridor descended farther than anyone had admitted. He said the final steps dropped toward a lower darkness beyond the lantern's reach. He claimed that when he stood in the opening, the jail sounds vanished. No chains, no voices, just a stillness so complete it felt like the building above did not exist. Then came the detail almost no summary repeats in full. He told the hearing there were marks on one of the inner stones, not words, not numbers, marks cut too deep and too deliberate to be accidental, curved lines crossing vertical grooves, repeated in a pattern. He didn't know what they meant, but he was certain they were older than the jail and not made by prisoners. That statement should have triggered a survey, an inspection, at the very least a proper architectural review. Instead, the space was sealed. And after it was sealed, the witness nearly disappears. His name thins out in the record, transfer mention, release possibility, one vague note, then nothing clean enough to follow. The man who described the corridor fades out exactly when the corridor itself vanishes behind fresh brick. That alone would be suspicious, but the strangest part may be what happened to the hearing papers. Because later county inventories reference a packet tied to basement testimony and structural correspondence, but the packet itself is absent. Not destroyed on record, not formally archived, just referenced, then gone. And when a case loses the witness, the plans, and the papers, you have to ask the question official history always hopes no one asks. What was so dangerous about simply leaving the wall alone?
This is where the story widens, because the more you look at old Maine buildings, the less isolated this basement starts to feel. Across older towns, there are foundations with buried windows, granite walls that continue below modern grade, side doors that open into dirt, lower arches swallowed by raised streets, service tunnels that do not line up with the age of the structures above them, whole stretches of older construction hidden beneath later civic facades, as if the visible town is only the top layer of something heavier underneath. Most people notice these things and move on. An old city settles, roads rise, basements flood, nothing mysterious. That is the official rhythm, practical explanations, piece by piece, no larger pattern. But cases like the Maine corridor create a problem for that rhythm, because when a witness inside a county cell starts describing older stone behind newer walls, and officials respond by bricking it shut instead of documenting it, the issue is no longer ordinary aging. The issue is selective visibility. What gets shown, what gets sealed, what gets renamed as maintenance. And once you start following that pattern, another tension appears. Official buildings are often treated like stable anchors of history, but many of them were built in stages over reused ground, courthouses over merchant lots, jails beside older storage vaults, public halls joined to pre-existing foundations no one wanted to fully excavate because excavation raises questions. Questions cost money. Questions delay projects. Questions expose older maps that do not match accepted timelines. So what do institutions do when older layers interfere with the clean story of how a place began? Sometimes they study them, sometimes they display them, and sometimes, when the layer below is too awkward, too deep, too impossible, they wall it off and call it reinforcement.
In the Maine case, suppression does not look theatrical. It looks bureaucratic. That is what makes it convincing. No dramatic secret society, no grand speech, just a hearing minimized, a repair order rushed through, a basement shortened on paper, and an inconvenient witness allowed to fall out of memory. That is how real erasure usually works, quietly, professionally, under budget. And yet there's one more detail that pushes this beyond a simple buried corridor. Some descriptions of the rear stone mention proportions that do not feel standard. Door height oddities, iron placements higher than expected, step depth broader than practical for a cramped jail extension. None of that proves giants, none of it proves some lost race hidden under New England. But it does raise a dangerous possibility that the lower space was not built for the people using the upper space, that it belonged to another phase, another purpose, maybe even another scale of architecture entirely. And if that is true, the bricked wall did more than hide a hallway. It hid a mismatch, a physical contradiction, a place where the official age and purpose of the building stopped making sense. Once a state building contains that kind of contradiction, everything around it becomes unstable. Because if one corridor was inherited from something older, what else was?
Now imagine the full implication. Not one strange jail, not one disturbed witness, not one sealed passage. Imagine that the hearing accidentally touched the edge of a buried system already half known to the men who managed that building. A lower run, an older foundation line, a hidden corridor connected to pre-jail stone, pre-street grade, maybe even pre-town occupation as officially remembered. That possibility changes the emotional center of the story. This is no longer about whether a prisoner told the truth. It is about whether the town itself was standing on a level of history it had chosen not to name. And if that sounds too large, look at the sequence again. A witness reports a hollow wall, steps, rings, older stone, and descending space. Officials do not publicly disprove him. They do not open the area and show the public harmless construction debris. They do not preserve the site for review. They seal it, fast, after the hearing. That is not confidence. That is containment. And containment only happens when exposure is more dangerous than rumor. Maybe the danger was legal, property boundaries, liability, structural panic. Or maybe the danger was narrative. Maybe the lower corridor suggested the accepted story of the building was incomplete. Maybe it connected to a foundation older than anyone wanted to admit. Maybe there were chambers beyond the sealed arch. Maybe the marks on the stone were real. Maybe the rings were set high because the space had once served a use modern officials could not explain without inviting questions they could never control. This is where hidden history cases become so powerful, not because they always prove the biggest theory, but because they reveal the edges where official certainty starts to shake. The Maine witness stood in one of those edges, a basement cell, a flaking wall, a sliver of old air, and suddenly the clean story of the building was gone. In its place was a vertical history, one level visible, one level denied, one level possibly much older than the records above it. And buried layers do something to the mind. They force you to picture a different world existing under your own, another street under the street, another room behind the wall, another timeline below the one you were taught. That is why stories like this never really die. Even when the papers vanish, even when the wall is sealed, the image remains. The witness holding a lantern toward a gap in the stone, the steps disappearing downward, the sense that the building was not ending where it was supposed to end. Maybe that is what frightened the most. Not treasure, not scandal, depth.
because depth means precedent. It means somebody was there before the official beginning. It means the neat civic story may have been built over leftovers from something more complicated, more forgotten, maybe more advanced in ways we no longer expect. And if one hidden corridor survived inside a Maine basement until a hearing forced it into the open, then how many other civic buildings are still carrying those buried contradictions inside their walls right now? How many old courthouses, how many armories, how many schools, churches, lockups, and municipal halls are resting on sealed lower rooms that do not fit the dates printed on their plaques? Once you see that possibility, the story stops being local. It becomes civilizational.
So here is the part that stays with me. Not the hearing, not the brick, not even the vanished packet. It is the idea that for one brief moment the truth was spoken aloud in a public room, and the room chose the wall instead. That is what makes this case feel so dark. The witness may have been poor, tired, discredited, half frozen in a basement cell, but for a moment he had something the officials did not have: direct contact. He had heard the hollow space. He had felt the draft. He had seen the older steps with his own eyes. And when he described them, the system did what systems often do when confronted by an inconvenient layer of reality. It reduced the man. Then it reduced the record. Then it reduced the space, until all that remained was a repaired wall and a story small enough to ignore. But some stories are too physical to disappear. A shortened basement line on a later sketch, a rushed masonry order, a phrase like older work, a missing packet, a remembered warning never to mention the back run. These are not proof of every theory people want to attach to them, but they are proof of resistance. Proof that something in that building did not fit the tidy version. And when history starts resisting its own paperwork, you should pay attention. Because maybe the real buried past is not hidden in deserts or remote mountains. Maybe part of it sits under ordinary town halls, county buildings, and public foundations all across places people assume are fully known. Maybe the lost world is not far away. Maybe it is under the oldest stairwell in your city, behind a painted wall in a courthouse basement, beneath a sealed service door no one has opened in 100 years. And maybe the reason these stories keep resurfacing is simple. The buried past is not gone. It is pressing upward, through cracks, through witness testimony.